Get an additional speaker who's not on the schedule. I was able to meet him last night and invite him over, and that's Abraham Bolden, who's written this book, Echoes from Dealey Plaza, and I was really glad that he was coming. I asked him yesterday if he talked about Daniel Groth, and he said no, he hadn't mentioned him. But Daniel Groth, I hope he'll talk about him today, was a guy that was in the Chicago Police Force, but that was basically his cover, and he was Office of Naval Intelligence. And he was responsible for the arrest of Thomas Arthur Valley, who had ID for Lee Harvey Oswald and was part of the Chicago plot that had to be pulled off. And so they arrested Valley and took him out of the operation. But Daniel Groth later led the Chicago police raid on Mark Clark and Fred Hampton, the Black Panthers, and he was part of COINTELPRO operations later in California as well against the American Indian movement and Panthers and other activists out there. So I'm hoping Abraham will talk a little about what he knows about him. Russ Baker is with us now. He's an award-winning investigative journalist. He's written for The New Yorker and for Vanity Fair and The New York Times and The Nation and The Los Angeles Times and The Washington Post, The Village Voice and Esquire. And he served as a contributing editor to the Columbia Journalism Review. And he has a website, whowhatwhy.com. Nonpartisan, nonprofit news website, and he's done this book, Family of Secrets. So I don't know how he did all that regular journalism and still came to the right conclusion here in the book, but somehow it happened. So, but anyway, I'm glad that he's with us, and he's going to talk to us for about a half an hour, and then we can have some questions. Thanks.
Just keep that
Behind the door, Chris.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here at COPA. I was just over at your cousin organization, Cabana, so got the COPA Cabana going. They gave me an hour. I'll have to condense somehow here in half an hour, which means I should probably stop with my preface and just get started. I know probably less about the Kennedy assassination than everyone in this room, and I know a certain specific area, and that's how I work. I only know what I know and what I personally researched and was able to verify. My work for Family of Secrets was an effort to try to understand the rise of the Bush family, and I kind of stumbled on the JFK material sort of by accident. I was trying to understand the relationship between George H.W., nicknamed Poppy, and George W., nicknamed W., Bush. And so as I was researching that, and I wrote a number of articles in 2004, you may have seen some of them about George W.'s National Guard service record or lack thereof. And so one of the things that struck me was that there was a sense that that I'll just use their nicknames, Poppy and W were somehow estranged, that W was very much a completely different character than his father with his own set of values and advisors. But in fact, the more I looked, the more I saw, no, there was actually the exact same people were in the same administrations, in both of their administrations, and that really they had a very similar worldview, although a very different affect, which was, I believe, they took that affect and they played that out. They actually enhanced it in order to make the son electable. We know the father was never really very popular politically. He ran for president in 1980 and lost against Reagan. And then in 1988 he was elected because he'd been the sitting vice president, and he was running against Dukakis, and they managed to do a number of numbers on Dukakis and weaken him. And then he was not reelected in 1992. So he was no great shakes when it came to wooing the public, and as I document in Family of Secrets, they made a major effort to sort of remake the son in a whole different way. And so the father was an Episcopal blue blood who could not shake the East Coast roots. The son was this very Texan guy with the cowboy boots and the chewing tobacco and slapping people on the back and the nicknames and the ranch that suddenly appeared right before the election and so on. It was a mastery of photo ops. They really had learned. And so I was very interested in this notion that the father and the son were different and estranged somehow, because everything I looked at, I kept seeing the fingerprints of the father. And I kept seeing the fingerprints of the father, for example, when I researched W's military service record, the first thing that struck me was here was a guy who seems to have just vanished from the military for 2 years, and I wondered, what did Dad have to say about that? You know, here was a family that was very, very dedicated to war, had a long history in the munitions business, father, grandfather, and so forth, all very supportive of Vietnam, and the son just walked away. And so I looked at all of the books, and I saw, and nobody seems to have ever asked Poppy, what did you know about W's disappearance for 2 years from the military, which is it's a felony, and in fact there is no statute of limitations, so somebody could today decide to look into that. But anyway, nobody seems to have ever asked a father. He never ventured an opinion. But as I began looking at this recreation of purported records and eyewitnesses and so forth to claim that he had served when he'd gone off to Alabama to work on a political campaign, I discovered what appeared to be the father's fingerprints in providing the cover-up. And that interested me more in the father, because I knew he'd been the CIA director, and he seemed to have a knack for these kind of things. He also very curiously always seemed to be not to know about things that were going right around him, especially things which would have been of deep, integral interest to him. For example, Iran-Contra, one of the most important, now forgotten, amazingly, by most people. I mentioned they don't even remember what it was, but violations of the democratic system, abrogation of congressional imperatives, and so forth. And so he had said he was out of the loop, though he was vice president with a portfolio for covert operations. He was a former CIA director. He knew all of those people down there, and it was just preposterous. So the notion that he didn't know anything about his son, and then the evidence that he may have been involved in that. So then I went back and I thought, you know, George W. Bush would never have been president if his father had not been president. There's no question about that. He would never even have been elected governor of Texas. And so I thought, well, how did the father become president? And then I thought, you know, the father himself, you know, how did that happen actually? And so I started looking at the father, and I discovered that there were all these secrets about this family, and that when we had talked about the father, we had not contextualized him historically with the grandfather and these two great-grandfathers in this phenomenal apparatus of money and power that went way, way back. And I thought, well, we're missing some context here. So I looked at the father, and I thought, well, let's see, what do we know about him? Before he ran for president, he was the CIA director, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how he became CIA director. So I went back to the clippings, and I began reading from that period where he was named by Gerald Ford, and there was sort of this blank space. The media couldn't seem to quite figure out why he was the right guy to be the CIA director, so they would just kind of put random biographical facts. I remember one mentioned his tenure. He had been an envoy to Beijing, which I suppose they claimed was a qualification. But when you read back about his tenure as the envoy to Beijing, the New York Times, struggling to come up with anything to say about him that wasn't negative, said Mr. Bush was well known for throwing barbecues and the bike rides that he and Barbara took around Beijing. That was sort of the summary of his tenure there. So I thought this CIA thing is sort of interesting because this was the mid-'70s. This was the one moment in the history of this country where anybody has seriously held formal inquiries into a question I'm fascinated with, which is, what the heck is the CIA? What is that? You know, how did that come about? What does it do? Who knows what it does? What proper role would something like this have in a democratic society? And I'm not alone on that, because Harry Truman, who signed the act that created the CIA, later on, and I guess some of you may know this, exactly 30 days to the day after John F. Kennedy was dead, Harry Truman produced this statement in which it seemed to be having time to deliberately, and he said, you know, I'm concerned about these folks. And when I signed this act, he was told basically this would be an intelligence organization. They still call it that, but it was supposed to collect information and give it to the president, which is a proper role. Every government should have something like that. But he says, I never authorized this. I don't remember what he called it, monkey business or something. He's kind of folksy. It's a nice way to put assassinating democratically elected foreign leaders. But anyway, he was troubled by this. And of course, we know Dwight D. Eisenhower, himself a general, was troubled by what he very courageously labeled on his way out the door, the military-industrial complex. All of these people started warning about these things. And so here you have the mid-'70s, and suddenly there's this opening. Senator Frank Church and Congressman Otis Pike are holding these these hearings into what is the CIA? What about all this stuff? We're getting evidence they've done MK Ultra mind control experiments to see if you could create a Manchurian candidate. All of these just sort of science fiction type things, and so and so I was fascinated that at the height of the inquiries into the CIA, when they really were at the most sensitive moment, and there was a move afoot to kind of end the whole covert operations capacity, get rid of a lot of the people in the agency who were seen as most problematical. The agency chooses, out of everybody possible, Poppy Bush. And I thought, well, that's strange. And they sort of described him as a kind of a quote-unquote intelligence virgin, somebody who had no background in intelligence, but had been a congressman, had been briefly an envoy and so forth, and was a respectable person to be the public face of the agency. It still seemed strange to me. And so I kept looking, and I started running across some things you may have seen that have been floating out there that indicated that maybe he wasn't really an intelligence virgin after all. And one of the documents that I published an article on a couple of years ago online was a document showing that 23 years before he was CIA director, he started an offshore drilling company called Zapata Offshore with a man named Devine, who was a CIA officer, purportedly resigned at the age of about 26 to go into the oil business with Mr. Bush. And of course, we know historically, and I know many people from the agency, and they've confirmed this to me, that this is just a standard thing that if you're doing something where you need deniability, you quote-unquote resign. I mean, E. Howard Hunt had done that in the Watergate period, and yet there's clear indications that he was very much still working for the agency. So we have very serious indications that Mr. Bush was somehow working with the CIA all the way back when he was a very, very young man. And in fact, I've studied his company and I've looked at his travels and so forth, and there is no way, and I've been in business, there's no way that it makes sense from a practical business standpoint. He had a tiny company that leased just a handful of rigs, and he was going all over the world. It was almost frenetic. And later on, we see indications that he was stopping at CIA stations around the world, visiting with certain folks, and it paints a certain picture, let's say. So I was very interested in him. And then I became aware of certain other things, such as you may have seen this. This was reported in Kitty Kelly's book and in a number of other places, that some years ago when the elder Bush was interviewed and they were just sort of asking him benign questions. Yeah, you ask people about historic events and what they remember about them. And so somebody asked him, and they said, do you remember where you were the day that Kennedy was shot? And he didn't know. He did not remember where he was that day. And wherever I go, I always ask the audience, and we'll do it here, I guess, how many of you were 5 years old or over November 22, 1963? Okay. And of those of you, of that subset, how many of you do not remember where you were that day? Anybody? You sure? It's okay. It's okay. Nobody. Okay. Anyway, he didn't remember, and that interested me, and so I thought, well, I'm curious about that, and then I spent 2 years of my life trying to answer that question. The result is 4 chapters in Family of Secrets about the Kennedy assassination and about that curious answer. Because we don't have a lot of time here, I'm going to have to kind of race through some of the highlights here, but basically, there are 2 declassified documents out there, originally reported by other journalists, and they garnered very little attention. One showed that on November 23, the FBI had some sort of consultation at the request of the State Department, which claimed to be concerned about right-wing Cuban exiles using the Kennedy assassination as an opportunity, as a signal or something to launch an invasion of Cuba. I mean, the whole memo itself is preposterous, and I do believe that a lot of these government memos are covering documents, but they have certain trace elements of truth. And so the mere fact that they created this document meant that there was something there that they were covering up. And so often the names of participants, at least, are significant. They're not invented out of whole cloth. This document said that 2 people were involved in this briefing with allied intelligence agencies, one a man from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the other a man from the CIA, and they named him, and it was Mr. George Bush. Well, if this document was correct, then this was the FBI at least signaling somehow, and we know there were complex rivalries between these agencies, and that they were signaling that Mr. Bush was in the CIA and was somehow involved in working with right-wing Cuban exiles who hated John Kennedy at the time of the assassination. I am seriously thinking now that that may have been some attempt by the FBI to sort of level the playing field in these internecine battles. But in any case, there's that document. And then there's another one. And so now we have the guy who can't remember where he was. Then we have the guy who should have remembered where he was because he was working for the CIA in something related to the Kennedy assassination. And now comes another document. And this is discovered by another journalist. Again, it's completely ignored at the time that it comes out. And this is a memo from the Houston office of the FBI, and it has a Mr. George, this time it's not just George Bush, it's Mr. George H.W. Bush of whatever, 6226 Briar, Houston, Texas, of Zapata Offshore, and he's calling this FBI office in Houston. He's not in Houston, and I don't know why he's calling Houston since the assassination's in Dallas, but he's calling there, and he says, I'd like to offer some information. I'd like to be my name to be kept anonymous, and not to be released to the public, but I may know who has shot the president. So I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, even before I go any further, here's the same guy, can't remember where he is, and in another one he's a CIA agent, and in a third one he's a private citizen knowing who shot the president. So I think, boy, that's pretty interesting. So I go a little further, and I start looking into this, and he fingers a guy in Houston, and he says, you know, I don't know much about him, but he's been talking about doing something president, and I just thought I ought to let you know. And by the way, I'm calling from Tyler, Texas. And he said, I'm gonna fly to Dallas. I'll be staying at the Sheraton, and then I'm gonna head home to Houston if you want to contact me. So I started looking at that, and I spent months and months and months. And I have one of these chapters is only about this phone call. And it's called Where Was Poppy? And I go back and I trace this whole thing. I actually find a former aide to him, and I discover that at the very moment that he was calling the FBI at 1:45 p.m. to finger a man as a possible suspect who he said he didn't know much about, his own assistant, Mr. Bush's own assistant, was at the man's house asking him to do some political favors for Mr. Bush, and ultimately drove him to the Secret Service offices to clear him. So I said, well, that's strange. I mean, why would his assistant be clearing the guy he's ratting out unless they're not really ratting him out? And of course, it turned out the man had nothing to do with anything. He was harmless, essentially. In fact, he was such a Bush advocate that he, even years later, after he learned that he was mentioned in this document, he was working on the Bush campaigns. So you wonder what that was all about. And the only thing I could conclude was the fact that the document said, oh, by the way, I'm calling from Tyler, Texas. And I thought, well, the only thing I could figure out was he wanted to make the point that he was in Tyler, Texas, which was anywhere but Dallas. And I thought, well, why would he do that? So I started tracing things, and I found a letter. Even though Poppy couldn't remember where he was, Barbara remembered. She remembered only in 1993, 94, as Oliver Stone's movie was out and everything. She suddenly remembered, and she puts out these banal memoirs, which contain a letter in there where she's at a beauty parlor in Tyler, and they hear this awful news and so forth. But there are little clues in the letter, and so I go into the clues in the letter. And she says, we were on our friend Mr. Zeppo's plane, and I look him up, and I can't find a Zeppo except one of the Marx brothers. And so I keep looking, and this took me about a month, and then I realized she had misspelled his last name, and I thought, gee, there's in the book, I wonder if that was an accident or not, but it was Mr. Zeppa, and he was all connected with all kinds of interesting drilling operations all over the world. As a young man, he had been involved with the Rockefeller Bank and so forth, and he was very steeped in, let's say, elite circles himself. And so they'd been on this man's private plane, and it became clear to me that, I wondered, well, okay, so he was in Tyler at 1:45 p.m. How far is Tyler from Dallas? I talked to people who had planes. They said, well, it's just like a puddle jump, practically. It take no time at all to get there, particularly if you're going from Love to that little airport there. And then what he did was he showed up at 1-something to make a speech that had been planned in Tyler to a Kiwanis Club. And I talked to the man from the Kiwanis Club, and he did remember how just as Mr. Bush was supposed to get up and make a speech because he was running for U.S. Senate, another reason he should have remembered where he was, being an active critic of Kennedy and on the circuit right there in that area at the time of the assassination. So this man told me, he said, Mr. Bush got up and he said, "I've just heard that the president's been shot, so I really don't think I should continue my speech. Thank you very much." And I said, "What was his affect?" He said, "Oh, he was really calm. You know, he was just incredibly calm." And then apparently he left and he went to this payphone and he called the FBI with this strange tip. So I started looking more into him, and I discovered that there was a guy named George de Mohrenschildt. You all probably knew who he was. I didn't know who he was, but I got interested in him, and I spent a year on George de Mohrenschildt. And there are a number of researchers who've written things on him, and so of course I looked at all of that stuff, and then I tried to go further, and I've written a whole chapter just on George de Mohrenschildt, who turns out to be a fascinating figure. And it has occurred to me that you can't understand what happened in the Kennedy assassination unless you study these figures. And I agree there are hundreds of interesting figures, and I agree I'm interested in what people did in Mexico City and New Orleans and stuff, but here you're talking about people right in Dallas who were directly connected to the most powerful people in the country. And it seems interesting to me how a lot of the Kennedy assassination debate dances around the very core of the thing, which is cui bono, who stood to benefit the most, who was in the best position, if anybody was, to effectuate something like this. And so I began looking at those people, and I looked at George de Mohrenschildt, and what interested me about him was that he was basically sort of Lee Harvey Oswald's favorite uncle, godfather, guardian angel, whatever you want to call him. You know those sitcoms where there's the guy who, like, Three's Company, is always coming over for some reason? That was George de Mohrenschildt. He was always there with the Oswalds. He was driving them to dental appointments and, helping them find lodging, introducing them to people, taking them to dinner parties. They introduced him to Ruth Paine, who then sort of took them on next. And it's very clear when you look at him that he was an intelligence officer. He was a very deep cover intelligence officer. They had spent decades trying to sort of smear his trail to make it seem maybe he was a foreign agent and stuff. But if he was a foreign agent, they would have never allowed him to operate the way he did in Dallas high society and so on. So what interested me about George de Mohrenschildt was not only that he was close with Oswald, but that he was very, very close with Poppy Bush. And what I learned was that he had basically been, when Poppy was in prep school at Andover, George de Mohrenschildt, he had a roommate, and George de Mohrenschildt was a roommate's uncle. Now you'd say, well, what does that mean? But in fact, in those small circles, when you lived in a little house, just a couple of you for a year or what have you, and during holidays they often visited each other's families. And of course, George de Mohrenschildt, he was this white Russian emigre from a family that was in the oil business. So you know that the grandfather and so on, they would have, of course, been interested to meet these people because that's what they did. A lot of it was connections and getting to know always. Poppy was like that. Prescott was like it. I want to meet all your friends and their families, have them come over. So there was George de Mohrenschildt. And what was very interesting to me was the Warren Commission could not ignore this man because he... How am I doing on time, by the way?
Look.
I feel like I just started, it's... Well, all right, well, anyway...
You got 3 minutes.
3 now, go.
Look, go over. What gives us more extra time?
It says right. Oh, it's okay for you.
George de Mohrenschildt, what was interesting, the Warren Commission could not ignore him, so he was the most interviewed. If you ever read those transcripts, it goes on for, I think there's like 1,000 pages or something. It's some crazy amount of stuff, interviews with de Mohrenschildt, and there's like nothing in there. Every time he says something, like they said, okay, and then what did you do? You came to the United States, and then he says, yes, and I lived on Park Avenue, and then, okay, now what's next? This is a guy connected to Oswald who just killed, supposedly, the president. And this guy is his best friend, so they're like, okay, then what did you do? And then I went down to Texas, and I had lunch with my friend, the chairman of Humble Oil, and they were like, okay, and then what did you do? And then I thought, well, wait a minute, we're glossing over something here. I mean, this man, this mysterious man, knows all these incredibly powerful people, and they just skipped right over it. And so, in fact, even de Mohrenschildt himself, who was a master at cover stories and who was expecting to be interviewed, at one point he was so befuddled by how ridiculous the questioning was, he said, I must say, I never expected such questions, because they asked him, they said, they literally said, you have a nice tan, don't you? And you're a strong, robust guy. Do you like outdoor sports? I mean, it was just crazy. And it was very clear that the man questioning him didn't want to get into anything. Anyway, there's a history on the man who was questioning him. I learned new things about the Warren Commission and what it was and how they selected the staff that I have not seen anywhere before. Anyway, the backstory is when George H.W. Bush was head of the CIA, a letter comes in, received by the staff, and it's from a desperate-sounding man, and his name is George Demarco, and he says, I need some help. Perhaps I've been indiscreet in talking too much about Lee H. Oswald, but I feel that a net is closing in on me, and I'm an old man, and I'd appreciate if you could do something about this. Now, that's an interesting letter. The staff gets it. They think, oh, this guy's a kook, but they say to Director Bush, by any chance, just before we get rid of this, do you know this guy? Well, you know, he couldn't deny that he knew him because a lot of people knew that they knew each other. So he wrote this little letter. He typed it out himself, and it's in Family of Secrets. He says, I did know this man. He was the uncle of my roommate. You know, we knew each other a little bit over the years. I know he had some money. He was in oil. And then he said he had some connection. His name came out when Oswald shot to prominence. I kid you not. Talk about a bad pun. And then he says, I don't remember any details. Now, this is the man who was the head of the Central Intelligence Agency that we count on to protect our national security, obviously to protect our president. He's not even curious how his good friend is connected to the man who killed the president. That on its face, you could forget all this other stuff, but if you don't focus on what I'm talking about, what do you have here? You know, what do you have here? You could talk about the two Oswalds and this and that, but right here at the core of the thing is a man from one of the most powerful political families in the country. He's directly connected to the man who was shepherding Lee Harvey Oswald, and he's not curious about this. Okay? Anyway, no more time to go into this, but what I do with Family of Secrets is I go into hundreds of things like this. There's so many revelations. I learned what the Texas School Book Depository was, which I didn't know. Does anybody know what that is? It's a building, right? Wrong. It's not a building. That building had another name. It was called something else, and what happened was, in the year before the assassination, the building was largely empty, and a company called the Texas School Book Depository, which had adequate facilities somewhere else, which was run by a man involved with the American Legion, paramilitary operations, a very far right-wing man, connected in all sorts of murky groups and secret societies, was asked to move some of his people into the building. And I also happen to know, and some of this is not in the book, but that in the fall of 1963, they didn't need any employees at all. They didn't need any employees because they were a seasonal business shipping books to schools. And so they would traditionally lay off all of their people in the fall, but somehow Mr. Oswald was such a nice man, and he asked them, would you keep me on? And they, well, you know, they were sympathetic because they were those kind of capitalists, and so they kept him on conveniently so he could shoot Kennedy. Anyway, a lot more to talk about. Obviously not time here.
Yeah, take a few more minutes.
Are you just avoiding speaking yourself? Or?
No, I'm just trying to...
We can Q&A too after this, right? You can go on. Keep talking. Okay.
Well, I mean, there's hundreds of things like this. So then I looked at how Oswald got his job in the building, and I with all due deference, and I know a lot of you have written wonderful books, but I looked, I bought all these books, and I kept going through them, and I was like, I don't see any explanation for this. The explanation was that in some employment agency, somebody had told him about it, and I thought, well, you know, you got to look a little more. Now, this is me as the journalist. I'm very painstaking about this stuff, and I want to know the exact chain of custody on that job. And so the story was that Ruth Payne, you probably all know this, that Ruth Payne had learned from a neighbor that there was an opening at the Texas School Book Depository. Well, as I'm telling you, there were no openings because they didn't need anybody. But what had happened was this neighbor's brother, this Wesley Buell Frazier, had obtained a job in the building. So that's the end of the inquiries. The brother knew about the job, told Oswald. So I thought, well, how'd Wesley Buell Frazier get his job in the book depository? I started looking. What I discovered was he was this kid with no skills. He lived in some little town way out, and somehow he was contacted, and they said, hey, how'd you like a job? And he said, fantastic. I'll come to Dallas. So they put him in there days before Lee Harvey Oswald gets the job referral from him. Think about that. What's going on there? I mean, these are not that complicated things, but we fail to look carefully enough at what's going on. And so you see a very clear pattern here of people on a compartmentalized basis being put in position to do certain things. And just to talk for a minute about the bigger picture, the reason I'm interested in all this is I'm not what you would call a JFK buff. I've never been in one of these conferences before, but there's a larger picture here, and the reason that that your inquiries get demonized as, you know, nuttery and conspiracy theories is because it doesn't get contextualized into the larger framework. And for me, the larger framework is how does power work in this country or any country? In every society, there are elites. There are wealthy people, and there are companies and so forth, and they try to protect their prerogatives. That's not fantasy. Everybody knows that that's the way it is. We also know that when there are national liberation movements and attempts to nationalize property and so forth that threaten those interests, they take action. And we know that the United States has a long history of siding with outfits like United Fruit and Freeport Mining or what have you, and going into these places and doing their bidding. And so the only question is the United States the only place on earth where democracy reigns perfectly and none of these things where the stakes are the highest actually take place? So the same people who admitted that they were okay with taking out Lumumba and Trujillo and Arbenz and Mossadegh and on and on and on, there actually are dozens of these people, most of whom were never mentioned, also in Ecuador and anyway, Bolivia, and so do they suddenly in the United States love these Obama rallies and this idea that any person who wants to be president can grow up and be president and do whatever they want? It just doesn't make any sense. So my general thesis, I would say, is that we don't do enough looking at history, studying history in an investigative vein, and then contextualizing it with current affairs. I have started a nonprofit called whowhatwhy.com, and it is because I can't do this kind of work in the sort of traditional corporate-owned media for obvious reasons. That media, in any case, is sort of disappearing as we speak. We don't know what will come up in its place. There's a lot of chatter on the internet, but a lot of it is speculation and opinion, and we feel that there's a need for serious, trained journalists who are objective and don't have an axe to grind to look at these things and to be open to letting the facts go wherever they happen to go. Sometimes when I was working on the book about the Bushes, the people would tell me very nefarious things about them, and I would find out it wasn't true. And so I said it wasn't true. And that's crucial, that you be open to changing your mind about things. So who, what, why, what we're trying to do is get public support, and there's a place on there if you're interested. I know none of us have any money, but you can go on there even for the price of a burger and a beer a month, $20 a month. Click on there and it puts it on your PayPal or your credit card. And if we can get a few thousand people to do that, we can assemble a small staff. And we want to do three things. We want to do more historical reporting. We'd like to look further into this. We'd like to look into Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, George Wallace, anybody, frankly, because I see similar patterns with all of these things, very, very similar. And I find it strange that in every other country in the world, when powerful people were killed, in most cases it was identified as an organized effort, but in the United States it's always a lone kook. And I actually asked statisticians about that, and they said that doesn't make any sense. It really just seems improbable. So we'd like to look at the historical stuff. We would like to do long-term projects about things like global warming, why it is we can't seem to do anything to save humanity on that front, why it is so hard when everybody in this country seems like they'd like to have something like Medicare, that it's so difficult to get that passed, why it is that these mobs suddenly assemble at these town meetings and start yelling inaccuracies, where do they get that information from, all of these crucial things, the economy, why does it seem that basically very similar people to the people who were working for Bush are now working for Obama? Why is Robert Gates, who was a CIA director under the father Bush, a Pentagon secretary under W, still in there under Obama? Why is it that the President of the United States seems so hemmed in, even if you assume the best about him, and it's certainly reasonable to do that he may simply have no options? I wrote an article recently on Truth Out called What Obama is Up Against. The evidence suggests that every president, this is one of the themes of Family Secrets, every president has been under pressure from the things that Truman and Eisenhower warned against. FDR faced an attempted coup with General Smedley Butler. I mean, all of these presidents have faced the same thing. I mean, this is terrifying. And as I say in Family of Secrets, I have a whole new story of Richard Nixon. Wherever Richard Nixon is now, he's smiling down because my conclusion is that my assumptions about him, just as I thought that Oswald had done it, were wrong, and that Richard Nixon fell afoul of the exact same machinery that Kennedy did. And you see all the same players, the same Cubans, and you see the E. Howard Hunt, and you see all of the exact same people, and Poppy Bush all in there again, causing problems for this guy for something he had nothing to do with, because he did, and I've listened to these tapes, he had nothing to do with that burglary. And in fact, he didn't have anything to do with any of those things. Even the cover-up itself, he had a lawyer, a guy named John Dean, who's now for some reason a hero, who was goading him into a cover-up, saying, I know, okay, you didn't have anything to do with it, but still, we can't have this come out. And he's like, I don't know. Well, a lawyer is not supposed to be giving that kind of advice to do illegal activities. Well, today, Richard Nixon is reviled. John Dean is on Countdown and all these shows as a hero now, changed to be a liberal. Bob Woodward, who leaked the stuff that caused Nixon all these problems. Here he is 30 years later, and what did he do? He got a memo from General McChrystal forcing Obama's